Hello, welcome. This is JD Strange, and this is Strange TV, the Strange Edition. We're going to be talking about magical thinking today and esoteric kind of philosophies. And I've got with me Mr. Paul Wallis, otherwise known as the Toothless Truth Teller, who has a YouTube channel, which is one of my favorite channels, where he squats in a field and talks about all things kind of philosophical and about his life in Thailand. He's been here, 42, 43 years, I think now.
Yeah, 43 and counting, sir.
So we're not going to get these kind of, 2 weeks in the country travel advice. We're going right to the
No. And
no.
there's no 7-Eleven cheese toasty reviews either.
So if you were hoping for that, now is the time to switch off. We're going
Yeah.
to be
But
talking.
if you're looking for something that's really food for deep thought, then you've come to the right place.
This is the most bizarre show ever, where we talk about the occult in Thailand.
Oh,
Uh,
you've frozen up there a little bit, but that's okay.
I'll start again. This is the most bizarre show ever. We're talking about the occult in Thailand. Something that's been interesting for myself recently, and something that Paul talks about on his channel. And I want to go right back to some of your earlier experiences with um,
Right.
the consciousness migration, really, out of body experiences. Can you tell us about
Yeah.
the first time you had an experience in that domain?
Right. Okay. Well, I've had two in total. Neither of them were planned or consciously, engineered. The first one, I think I would have been 2021, riding a motorcycle on the island of Crete. And I worked for a farmer picking tomatoes, and he was a good guy, and he used to let me borrow his motorcycle so I could ride over the mountains to this 1830s resort where all these Scandinavian girls would be there on the Club 1830 holidays. And so I'd go there and I'd have to be back by 8 o'clock on Monday morning, and he'd let me borrow his bike. So it's about 5 o'clock in the morning, and I'm on my way back, and I'm on this 250cc motocross bike, and I come around this bend, in the mountains, and there was gravel on the road, and I lost my front wheel. I lost the front wheel, just went. No helmet, and I slammed into the ground. And the next thing I know, I'm looking down on myself. I can see the bike. I can see the back wheel whizzing around. I can hear the engine revving. I can see the white smoke. And I can see me laying next to it, face down. And I thought, holy shit, that's me. Oh my God, have I died? And at that very moment, boom, I'm right back in my body. And I can feel the pain from the broken wrist and the sprained arm and all the cuts and everything else. And it took me about 5 or 6 days to recover from that in a local government hospital. But it was so real that it had a profound effect on me, because I suddenly realized that my consciousness can exist outside of my physical body. And that was a real game changer for me, because up until that point, I was an out and out atheist, having been brought up a Catholic. I came from a Catholic family, which I denounced at about the age of 11. And so, yeah, that was a profound experience. And it kind of stayed with me, although I didn't really explore it anymore, but it did stay with me. And the second time was about 3 years later. And so I hardly slept for 2 weeks, and I didn't eat very much either. And I'd reached the point where, you know how it is when you don't sleep for a long time and you see things out of the corner of your eye, and you get into like a hyper level. You go into a different gear. And there was a picture on the wall, and I'm just staring at this picture. And the next thing I know, I'm slowly rising up. And I stop about 6 inches from the ceiling. I look down, and there is me laying in the chair with my mouth wide open and my eyes wide open. And I thought to myself, I've done it again. Wow, this is great. And I started to move around the room. I looked in front of me, and I kind of willed myself forward. And I moved around the room, and I stopped for a while, and I thought, let's see if I can go through the window, because I was on the second floor. And so I went straight through the window without any problem at all. And I'm outside the window, and I think to myself, oh, wow, I'm gonna whiz around the house a few times. And at that very moment, I got sucked back into my body, and it was an awful experience because somebody came in the room. I was sharing the flat with two other guys. And as much as I tried to do it again after that, I never could. I was never able to. And I got real close. I'd feel these waves up and down my body from my toes to my head. And I knew I was getting ready to do it, but it never happened. And I think it never happened because it wasn't fear, it was anticipation and excitement that stopped me. And both of those experiences were as real as anything I've experienced in this, on this plane.
But it's interesting that both experiences were a kind of step or two steps before the traditional kind of out of body experience where you go, leave the body, look down on
Yes.
the body, and then there's
And there
that
was no
next,
tunnel of light or
no
anything. There
tunnel
was
of
no
light,
other beings.
no life review. You were
None of
just
that.
in the early stages, but it still suggests that conscious migration is a thing, and I believe we do it when we sleep. I
Yes,
think
I do too.
consciousness
Yes.
goes somewhere else.
Yes.
Anyway, so there's two schools of thought, isn't there? One that the brain produces consciousness,
Right.
and the other school of thought, which I lean towards, and obviously you do, which you put forward in your book,
Right.
where you put consciousness on trial, um,
Yes.
that the brain is more of a receiver, like a
Yes.
a
An
radio
antenna, a receiver.
antenna.
Yes. 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 I firmly believe that.
And there's a lot of
The
evidence out
brain
there.
generates the concept, the theory that the brain generates consciousness is only actually a couple of 100 years old.
Yes.
And the case of Pam Reynolds basically destroys that theory because she was anesthetized to the point where you couldn't be any more anesthetized. They were going to remove a brain aneurysm, an aneurysm from her brain. And after the operation, it was an 8-hour operation. And after the operation, she told the surgeon what he did, what he said to the other people, and everything like that. And so, to me, that's proof. That's proof that the brain doesn't generate consciousness because her brain was offline.
They actually have rules in some hospitals in the surgery that the doctors and the nurses and the staff are not they shouldn't discuss things openly or verbally, because the patient can still, even though they're unconscious, they're still able to take on board that information.
Now,
Um,
here's an interesting thing. Here's an interesting thing on that topic. The 8 witnesses that I present in my book, yeah, the 8 researchers who've dedicated their life to this, 4 of them were cardiologists who researched it with the aim to disprove it. Their actual aim was, well, their idea was, this is hogwash, and I'm going to prove it's hogwash. And they ended up doing a 180-degree turn. And their opinion now is, well, it has to be that consciousness survives physical death. It has to be that. Yes.
but there was certainly a push in the kind of Victorian era in the 1880s, well, even before that, with Darwin and eugenics and the divide between science and more
Yes.
magical thinking. And we like to think because
Yeah.
something's more modern or new, it should be more correct. But I would
Right.
argue that a belief system that's been used for hundreds of thousands of years is perhaps more proven, and therefore
Absolutely.
we should give it a little bit more credit uh,
Yeah.
than we currently do. But there is this movement towards more kind of magical thinking and consciousness as a universal kind of entity rather than um,
Yes. And I
some,
believe for the first time ever, physicists are now sitting down with philosophers. They are actually talking together, and many physicists now accept that consciousness is fundamental. It's a fundamental aspect of the universe. And after, I don't know, 30, 50 years maybe, and I don't know how many billions of dollars, they can't come up with a single theory to show how the brain creates consciousness. And as in the words of Donald Hoffman, they never will because it doesn't. They're barking up the wrong tree. And scientists have to accept that certain things are metaphysical and there's no concrete physical proof.
what do you feel the
And
incentive is for um, government scientists to try and um, make us believe that consciousness is it's self-governed, is created in the brain,
generated by the brain.
and when it dies, it dies. Is it to improve?
Well,
Is it a capitalist thing to improve workforce?
no,
Um,
my theory is that the powers that be, let's call them the deep state, the Illuminati, the cabal, they do not want us to know what we are. Because if we know that we are a lot more than our physical body, then the game is up for them. And I believe that they have control of every single aspect of society, universities, the media, research and development, you know?
on the one hand, they're pushing this scientific model, and on the other hand, they're practicing like occult
Yes,
traditions.
they are.
So
Yes, they are.
don't do as we do, do as we say.
Right. I mean, I'm
Uh,
sure you've heard of the book The Secret by Rhonda Byrne.
right.
You know, that book sold millions of copies. And basically, in a nutshell, what she said is the powers that be have known about this for millennia, and they just don't want us to know. Because if we know what we are and the powers that we have, then they can control us no longer.
Absolutely. I wanted to go back after the two out of body experiences. You were not convinced of you were developing your own theories about consciousness, but not convinced about magical thinking and the occult, um, and esoteric
Yeah, I mean,
thinking
I
until
guess.
until that family incident, which
Yeah, I guess the way my thinking was after the second out of body experience. I mean, I was young, I was traveling, I wanted to see and experience everything. So I kind of just put that on the back burner. You know, it wasn't really a major thing in my life. Although I knew it was profound and I knew it was real, it gave me a nice, warm, fuzzy feeling because I thought to myself, well, if my consciousness can leave my physical body, then when my physical body dies, then my consciousness will not. So it gave me a warm, fuzzy feeling to know that death is not the end. But I
bit
never really looked further than that.
bit of a cheat code.
Well, yeah, yeah. And then something happened to my mother. Now, I would have been what, 28? I was selling windows, doing very well at that, making money in the UK, selling double glazing. And I was living in Bracknell in Berkshire, and my mother lived in Northampton. And my mother had had terrible luck regarding relationships. Since she divorced my father when I was 16, she'd just gone with a series of heavy drinkers and gamblers. And, you know, every relationship was a disaster for her. And then one day she phones me up and says she's met this lovely local farmer by the name of Roger. So I guess a couple of months went by and I went to see my mother and my sister who lived nearby. And I met Roger, giant of a man, you know, with a beard, looked a bit like Giant Haystacks. I don't know if you're old enough to remember Giant Haystacks, but he was a gentle giant, you know, and no experience with women, first relationship he'd ever had, and he owned a farm nearby. And my mother was so happy. She said to me, you know, Paul, I finally found the right one for me. And we love each other so much and we're made for each other. And I was so happy for her, you know. Few months go by and I get a call from my sister. And this is the middle of winter. I think it would have been the first week of January. And my sister says, I've got something to tell you about mother, Paul. I said, oh, okay. What's up with mother? Oh, she's in hospital. And I'm like, oh, is she sick? Has she had an accident? Well, no, not really. I said, well, what's up then? She said, well, she's tried to kill herself at least 3 times, and me and my husband can't handle it. So we got the doctors involved and they put her in a mental asylum near Northampton. And I'm like, what? My mother? And she said, can you come up? You know, we need some help here. So I'm like, yeah, of course I can come up. So the very next day, at crack of dawn, I get in the car and I drive, what, I don't know, 90 minutes to Northampton, go to see my sister. She tells me what she knows. She said, yeah, it all began 2 weeks ago when Roger just phoned her up one day, right out of the blue, and said, I don't want to see you anymore. No reason. And my mother, she just took it so bad. And she became suicidal. She couldn't eat, she couldn't sleep. And my sister didn't know what to do, you know, so she obviously contacted the GP and he referred her to a psychiatrist and they sectioned her for 28 days under the Mental Health Act for her own safety, you know. So I've gone along to this hospital. I want to see my mother, obviously, you know. And I do. I get to see her. She's in this nightgown and she starts swearing at me. What are you doing here? And I'm like, good God, my mother's never sworn at me in her life. And I said, well, mother, what's going on? You know, this is not you. What's happening here? I don't know what's going on, but Roger doesn't love me anymore and I can't deal with it. And she just burbled on and on, you know. So after about an hour, I went to see the psychiatrist and I said, well, I don't know what to say. And he said, well, you know, she's a danger to herself right now. We don't want to let her out. But in my short stay there, I'd seen a load of crazies. It was a little bit like One Flew Over the Cuckoo Nest, you know. So my concern was, well, if my mother spends any reasonable amount of time here, she's going to end up cuckoo like they are, you know. So I didn't want her to be there. And I think I stayed up there for 2 or 3 days. I went to see her one more time. And then I convinced the psychiatrist, after talking to my sister and her husband, I convinced the psychiatrist to let her out, to let us have custody of her. And he said, you know, you're going to have to watch her all the time. She's devious. You know, we don't let her near any metal implements, and she's never on her own, and she's being watched 24/7. So, you know, if you're sure you could deal with that? And I said, yeah, between us, we can do that. I'll stay there for a while, you know. So my mother gets her dressing gown on and gets this plastic bag of all her stuff, and she gets in the car with me. And I'm going to take her to her house. You know, she's got a couple of dogs who my sister was looking after. But, you know, my sister's arranged to be at the house, and, you know, it's all been planned. I've agreed with my sister and her husband that we're going to do this. So we're in the car, and my mother says to me, look, I want you to take me to see Roger one more time. And I said, well, I don't think that's a good idea, Mother. She said, no, I want him to tell me to my face that it's over. And if he does that, then I'll drop it and I'll get on with my life. I miss my dogs and all this. So she convinced me basically to take her to Roger's farm, which I did. Knocked on the door, left her in the car, knocked on the door. Roger opened the door, very surprised to see me. So I explained the situation. I said, look, you know, can you please tell my mother what she needs to hear? Yeah, he said, yes, bring her in. And it was very uncomfortable, James. It was. We sat at the kitchen table and he didn't know what to say, really. And I just said to him, look, you know, I don't agree with the way you did this. You just dropped it on her, you know, without any warning whatsoever. And he said to me, I'm sorry, it's the first relationship I've ever been in. I've got no experience with women. And I just woke up one morning and I don't want to see her anymore. So I didn't want to lie to her. I told her the truth. So I said, well, can you tell her now? Yes, he said. I don't think I had his, but he agreed. So I go back to the car. I get Mother. We go sit in the kitchen. Big oak table, you know, typical farmhouse. And he said, you know, look, Pam, he says, I'm very, very sorry about this. He said, I just woke up one morning and I don't want to see you anymore. I don't want to have a relationship with you, not even as a friend. And you haven't done anything wrong. And there's no other woman. In fact, you're the only woman I've ever had a relationship with. And I feel terrible about this, but I thought I should tell you the truth. Right, she said, that's all I wanted to know. Let's go. I want to go home. I want to see my dogs. So I said my goodbyes to him and got in the car with her and fired the car up, put the heater on and said to my mother, I'm just going in to have a quick chat with Roger. Don't be long, she said. So I go in there and I said to him, look, Roger, thank you for doing that. I said, please don't make any contact with her in the future because I want this to be a clean break. You know, you could have been a little bit more subtle about it, you know, initially, but I understand you got no experience with the opposite sex and, you know, you're a straight up guy. So, you know, there's no hard feelings on my part, but let's just leave it like that. And I was only in there, well, I don't know, 3 minutes. I opened the door and immediately I see that my mother is not in the car. About 30 meters from the car is this huge gravel pit. And my mother, in her nightgown with the dressing gown on, is walking into this gravel pit. And we're talking about almost freezing. It's about 1 degree. So I shout to Roger, come on, let's go. And we both run there. She disappears under the water, James. It's deep, you know, a couple of steps and she's gone. He just dived straight in, Roger did. He just dived straight in and grabbed her and pulled her out. And we got her in his house and we got all these towels and we sat her by the big Aga, you know, the big heater thing. And I used his phone and I called the hospital and spoke to the psychiatrist and said, look, you were right. We can't. She's tried to kill herself again. Can I bring her back? Yes, yes, please do, he said. So long story short, we took her back. I had to go back to work. So I had to leave it all with my sister, basically. She would go and see my mother every other day and she would look after the dogs. And, you know, I did feel a bit guilty about leaving it all to her. But I had a team of sales guys that I had to work with. You know, I had stuff to do. Commission only. I wasn't on a salary, you know, and so I just didn't have the time for it. Anyway, long story short, she came home 2 weeks later and I talked to her on the phone and she wasn't the same person. She just wasn't. And, you know, I would obviously talk to my sister every day and she said, no, she won't eat, she won't sleep. She keeps wandering around the house and I'm worried as hell about her, you know. And all of a sudden, I think it was a day later, I get a phone call from my mother. She said, Paul, I'm okay. I'm back to normal. And I'm like, wow, mother. And it was. She was just like she used to be. And I said, what happened? She said, you're never going to believe this. She said, yesterday afternoon, my doorbell rang. And I opened the door and there's this woman with white hair who introduces herself as Shirley. And Shirley says to me, I know what's wrong with you and I've come here to fix it. So I let Shirley in and Shirley told me to sit on the couch and she stood there and put her hands on my head, closed her eyes, muttered these words, and it lifted. Whatever it was, it lifted from me. And I feel wonderful again. And I'm like, oh, wow, this is fucking strange. Which is very apt for strange TV, isn't it? But anyway, I mean, of course, I was delighted about this, you know. I didn't really believe in this Shirley thing at all. But anyway, I thought, well, this is great. So I think it was about 2 weeks later, I went up to see my mother and my sister. You know, we're all having tea in my mother's living room, and she's great, you know, back to her old self. And she said, would you like to meet Shirley? Shirley doesn't live far away from here. I can call her if you like. So I said, well, yeah, okay then. So Shirley arrives about half an hour later. Quite a plump, middle-aged woman, you know, nice ambience, nice aura around her, very friendly, very quiet. And she said to me, I wanted to know what's going on, you know, what's happening. And she said, well, I'm a white witch. She said, and I was astrally traveling not long ago, and I saw your mother, and I saw she was being psychically attacked by another witch. And so I decided that I would help your mother, and I came to see her, and I put this protective shield around her. And the psychic energy that this witch had sent to my mother has now gone back to her twice as strong. So she won't be doing it anymore. She now knows that your mother is protected. So I'm listening to all this, you know. And I said, I told her about my out of body experiences.
Ah,
And she said, oh, yes, yes. You know, she said, I can do that at will. I said, can you? She said, yeah. So I thought about it for a while. And I said, well, look, would it bother you if I asked you to do an experiment for me right now? She said, no, it wouldn't bother me. What do you got in mind? I said, well, can I go in the kitchen and put a load of things on the kitchen table and then come back in here? And can you leave your body and go in the kitchen and tell me what I put on the table? Sure, I could do that, no problem. So she's sitting in the corner of the lounge, right? And the kitchen is like quite a way away. So I've gone into the kitchen and I think I put about 18 items on the table. I rummaged through drawers. I got an egg whisker, a tin of mustard, a wooden spoon, the trash bin, 3 candles, loads of stuff. I just put loads of stuff on the kitchen table. And I stood in the kitchen for about 5 minutes. And there's no way she could have seen. You know, there's no way. Because the doors were closed. And I said to my mother, you know, don't let her leave the room. And she just sat there with her eyes closed. So I came back in the room and I said, okay. And she said, yeah. She told me absolutely every item that was on the table. And then she said to me, and I'm very surprised that you would need that kind of evidence, being as you've already left your body a couple of times. Shame on you. And I sort of went, ooh. And then she said to me, have you got a picture of your house where you live? Well, my mother did. So my mother started to look through her photo albums, and she found a photo of my house and gave it to the woman. And she said, I'll just sit here for 10 or 15 minutes, you know, don't mind me. And about 10, 15 minutes later, she opened her eyes and she went on to explain to me what my house looked like. Inside, everything. She even told me that my son was asleep in the bed, but he was upside down. His feet were on the pillows. So I phoned my wife in England straight away. I phoned her up and I said, go and see what James is doing. His name was James. And she said, he's in bed. I said, well, go and have a look. She came back. She said, he's in bed. I said, was he up the right way? She said, no, he's upside down. His feet were on the pillow. Oh my God, that sent a chill through me, I can tell you. And I became very interested in this. I asked this woman a lot of questions about witchcraft. And she told me, she said, well, I've had this ability since I was young. And she said, do you want to know about the witch who attacked your mother? I said, yes, I do. She said, well, she has a farm right next to this guy, Roger. And she wants to have a relationship with him because she wants somewhere to put her horses. So she did something to Roger to stop him seeing your mother. And she did something to your mother too. And I'm like, oh my God. And that took me months to digest that.
and the interesting thing as well is your mum had no previous mental illness, no trauma,
Nothing.
and also
Nothing.
you mentioned she'd been in a number of different relationships as well, with like
Yes.
guys who were
She'd had
quite
bad
abusive,
luck. She'd had bad
like
luck.
drinkers, gamblers.
Yeah.
You would have thought if she were to get emotionally,
Yeah, right. Now, she
it would
was one of the most level-headed persons that I'd ever met in my life. It was so out of character. And it
fascinate.
was really was like she was a different person, James, for that short period of time. And so, of course, that experience left me in no doubt whatsoever that witchcraft is a real thing.
But Northampton has quite a tradition as well. You've got the likes of Alan Moore lives there, doesn't he?
Oh,
The
right. Okay.
cartoonist
I didn't know that.
occultist. So yeah, it's fascinating story. But did Mum and Roger ever
No,
get together again? That was
no,
no.
no. There was never any more contact. And my mother stayed single until she died at the age of 87. Yes. But it did change my mother. She became very spiritual. And she wasn't spiritual at all before that. She became very good friends with Shirley. And Shirley told her quite a few things about previous lives. And Shirley even told her that the reason why she's had all these ups and down relationships is because she's paying back karma for things she did in a previous life, which I thought was rather interesting.
Hmm. But moving on to like your time in traveling and Thailand and you know being a little older and wiser now, are there rituals or kind of practices that you do um, in the kind of non-secular kind of non-traditional religion?
Uh well, I let me put it this way. After I'd been married for about 15 years, I suppose, and I'd settled down, I had a couple of kids, I had a good job. I was very interested in Buddhism. I understood why the Thai people were the way they were. I realized that very early on, that it's all down to Buddhism. And I liked Buddhism because Buddhism is not fear-based, you know.
I always saw it as a
Buddhism,
philosophy, Buddhism,
yes, that's what I
rather than
was about to say.
yeah.
Yeah, it's not a religion, it's a philosophy.
But the Thais have more than Buddhism. They have
Animism as well,
animism
yes.
beliefs and also a mix of Hindi. They will
Yes,
worship Shiva and Ganesh and
yeah,
other deities. You can have if you look at a
right.
spirit house in Thailand,
Yes,
you might offer something to Ganesh to remove
yeah,
obstacles in your way, or Shiva
right.
for new beginnings, and
Yeah,
Buddha for other reasons.
yes,
There's a whole kind of buffet. But
yeah,
it's also ground in animism, which is a beautiful way of thinking. If you that everybody's kind of connected and everything is connected as well, even
right.
trees and
Yes, yes,
nature.
yeah,
Um, and I'd imagine up where you are in Sisaket, right? You see
yeah. Oh, very much so. Every house is a spirit house here. And if they're going to chop down a tree, they even ask the tree spirit for permission to fell it before they do. Yes, they are very, very spiritual here. And it's funny because a couple of locals that I've got to know, that I mentioned about my book, my latest book, Consciousness Survives Physical Death and Reincarnation is Real. And I'm a pretty good Thai speaker, so I could explain to them in their own language that I presented this case in the book that, there's solid evidence that we reincarnate. And they just looked at me like I had two heads, and they said, well, doesn't everybody know that?
it's like proving the sky is blue, isn't it? Of
Right. And
course.
I said, well, actually, no. I said, there's a lot of Westerners who believe that, when you die, and that's it. And they thought that was rather odd. Yeah. They thought that was rather odd.
the whole kind of Eastern versus Western mode of thinking is based on collectivism in the East, and
Yes,
individualism in
yes.
the West, and um,
And they don't mourn death. They celebrate it here, which I find very refreshing.
like the Irish.
Yeah, like one of my witnesses in the book, Peter Fennick. He was a a psychotherapist and a cardiologist, and he said it's insane what we do in the West. He said we sweep death under the carpet, we avoid it completely, and yet everybody has to experience it. It's insane. And I totally agree with him. I think children should be introduced to death. When the neighbor's dog bites the head off their hamster, then that's the period where you should say, well, okay, then, that that's not the end for the hamster. He'll come back as another animal, and we do as well. And I think death should be introduced to children.
So, which theory do you subscribe to when Hammy the hamster dies, or Lek dies in the village? Is it, if we go outside the body, let's say consciousness migrates, and the typical
Right.
example is the life review, and then
Yeah.
the cloud
Okay. Well,
above. Do we come
I'm
back
torn.
down, or
I'm
do we have a
torn
choice?
between. I'm torn between two theories here. I mean, I know a lot already. I know we go to the fine matter universe, and that's the dimension that's very close to the one we are in. And we spend a bit of time there, and the
Describe
life review and
describe
all that.
describe defined matter. Sorry, Paul. Describe for viewers who aren't familiar. Describe defined matter universe.
Okay, well, that's where I went when I had my out of body experiences. And the one thing I can remember about being in that state is that colors were much more vibrant, sound was different. And I just had this overwhelming feeling of contentment. I wouldn't say it was love or compassion, it was just contentment. But of course, I was only there for a very, very short time.
I've had every time that someone close to me's died, whether it be a family member or a close friend, I've always sat down and meditated, and
Right?
I've been struck by what you've just described, which is a kind of a sense of kind of knowledge, comfort, and kind of universal love. Um,
Yes.
that they seem to be transmitting to me, like everything's okay, this is great, it's wonderful where I am. And
Yeah.
I've had that 5 or 6 times now. Um,
Almost everybody who has a near death experience did not want to come back.
right.
And most of them have their lives changed profoundly after the experience. Some of them had to change their job. They were soldiers, or they were involved in culling animals or anything, something like that. And they couldn't do it anymore. And many of them got divorced from their partner because they just weren't the same person.
Talk about the experiments with telepathy that have been conducted recently with the intravenous administration of DMT. So they keep people um,
Right. Yes.
un un
Okay.
under the influence for a long period, and they seem to be communicating in this third realm. Um,
Yes. There's a hospital in London that is undergoing a large experiment where I think they've got 45 psychonauts, they call them volunteers.
Psychonauts.
Yeah, psychonauts who are prepared to be put into the DMT state with an IV. And So by putting them into an IV DMT state, they can keep them there for a long time. Now, this is a very controlled experiment. None of the psychonauts know each other. They're not aware of any of the others. They're deliberately kept apart, so they can't compare notes. And everything they say during their experiences is monitored. You know, it's all videoed, and then they're asked to explain what happened right afterwards when they come back. And what they're finding is astounding, because all of these people are communicating with the same entities. That rules out any kind of hallucination. And they are trying to map out the DMT space.
These experiments with the psychonauts and the band phenomena suggests that this dimension, this realm, has agency.
Yes,
It's
indeed.
not manifested. It's not manifest from the human, from the brain. It seems to
Right.
be its own entity with its own
Yes.
agency.
It is a dimension.
I've heard stories of people seeing code during
Yes.
do,
Yes,
do,
using a
do,
red light. If you use a red light in a certain sort of way, you see code. Yes. Yes, I've also heard that. Perhaps we're living in a simulation, James.
well, that is quite a popular theory, particularly among
Well,
the younger
I'm
generation.
sure you know about the double slit experiment and quantum physics. And that proves that if you're not looking at something, it doesn't exist in your universe. It's only when you look at it that the wave function collapses, and you see the particles, you see the object, whatever it might be. Now, if you think about a computer game like GTA, Grand Theft Auto, you know,
Only renders what you're looking at, right?
it only renders what you're looking at, because it doesn't need to render anything else. And so if you think about it like that, in fact, quite a few scientists have actually said the chances that we are not living in a simulation is close to zero. Yeah, I don't believe in God as in a deity, you know, an old man with a beard who sits in the cloud playing a harp. But I do believe there is a creator. And perhaps that is what the overwhelming feeling of love and compassion that people seem to get in near-death experiences. You know, perhaps that's what that is. They are coming into contact with source, perhaps. One
Yeah,
wants to know oneself. And maybe, just maybe, every single conscious agent is from the same source, and it's experiencing its own perception of the environment it's in. That's my theory. We're all one. We're all from the same source. Even bad people, I still love them. I just think they've made bad choices, because we all have free will. And that's stayed with me ever since then. I love everybody, and I love every living thing.
we've been speaking now for about an hour, I think, Paul, and it's been fantastic. Very
Yeah, what a
philosophical.
conversation.
Great stuff, great stuff. So, if people want to learn a little bit more about your theory on consciousness, here's the opportunity to plug your brilliant book, which I've read and enjoyed.
Okay, right, yeah. Consciousness survives physical death, and reincarnation is real. I presented it in a trial by jury format, where I'm the prosecutor, the writer, and I present 8 witnesses. And these 8 witnesses have dedicated their life to this topic. And I present the evidence, I instruct the reader, what they should do, and take their time. And then when they're ready, there's a website where they can leave their verdict. And I've had over 100 guilty verdicts so far, and no not guilties. So I'm very happy about that.
So the general consensus is amongst us and your readers that consciousness does survive death, and
yes, and reincarnation is real.
Reincarnation is real, and every night our consciousness goes on a little journey, I think.
I believe it does. Yes, I believe it does.
Great stuff. So if you're listening to this podcast, I often listen to podcasts when I'm falling asleep and the consciousness is in kind of mid migration. It's at the immigration counter, getting its passport stamped. Have a very nice journey, and we'll see you next time on Strange TV.